referred to as the secondary support system. And part of this system is essentially made up of organizations, right, who in a sense supplement the private sector and the public sector. And the other half of this secondary system is what we refer to as the citizen-based community relations and development system. Now, what do we mean by that? Well, the citizens-based community relations and development system is when we have citizens, mostly on a volunteer basis, diverse citizens who come together for the purposes of assisting, right, supporting, advising, assisting, encouraging, advocating, right, to the public and the private sector, ways of enhancing the quality of community life, ways of enhancing community relations, right, and the quality of community life more generally. Now, some would argue that this secondary system represents an inefficiency. It represents a failure in the design and management of the public sector and the private sector, and that folks of that perspective argue that once you start developing foundations and charities and a whole host of non-government organizations and non-profits and corporate social responsibilities, the problem here is often the gathering of funding and the use of funds to provide service and the provision of those services is poorly coordinated. Whereas if it was all done by government, the ability to examine and identify all the needs, to prioritize those needs, and then to distribute funding in a manner that represents the priority of those needs through the process of taxation and then distributing taxation to fund the various programs and in the priority that those services need to be provided, represents a much more efficient system. Some would argue it represents a much more efficient system. And that when we reduce the level of taxation needed to provide the necessary services, and we then rely on the secondary system, charities, foundations, non-government organizations, non-profit organizations, corporate social responsibilities, councils, associations, so on and so forth, who make up the process of securing funding, distributing funding, and providing services that the public sector and the private sector have failed, right, to provide or are not providing to the extent that is needed, that often the way that the secondary system does that is poorly coordinated. So, for example, you might get Denny's and Boeing and Black Belt and various other organizations not coordinating their corporate social responsibility efforts, so all of them end up funding homelessness, and no fund goes to addressing the eradication of hunger because they're not coordinating with each other. But if government raised more money through the taxation process, and there was one point of responsibility for identifying, prioritizing, and addressing needs, that it is unlikely that that lack of coordination would occur. On the other hand, there are others that argue that government just simply is not an efficient mechanism for identifying and addressing the critical needs or the important needs of a community. And that there are some things that government does well, but when government becomes too large, it becomes excessively inefficient. There isn't enough competition, creativity, innovation, and that this secondary system is necessary to produce some level of competition, innovation, creativity that advances the process of identifying, funding, and delivering goods and services that are needed to advance the quality of community life, particularly for at-risk citizens. So it's up to you to decide. I mean, there are people who believe the secondary system is a waste of time, and then there are those that believe that it is essential for maximizing the quality of community life for the most citizens. Now, in addition to this secondary system made up of these organizations that acquire and distribute funds and provide services that are not being provided at all or sufficiently by the public sector and the private sector, there is this citizens-based community relations and development system. Now, in some countries around the world, this is well developed. At the local level, there are diverse citizens who come together and support the process of assessing community needs, analyzing those needs, and advising on how best to advance community relations, the contribution of social relations to the quality of community life. And then the contribution of other key factors like education, infrastructure, so on and so forth. If we take the South Carolina situation, okay, we tend to be a relatively low tax state, and so relatively speaking, the government, the presence of our government in the overall process of providing goods and services is relatively lower than other states and certainly other countries. We have a reasonably advanced private sector, but we are certainly in the process of developing a far more mature and diverse private sector. And as a result of having a relatively low tax approach and a relatively lower presence of government within the general process of providing goods and services, and a relatively immature but rapidly maturing private sector, as a result of that, we tend to have a fairly well-developed secondary system made up of charities, foundations, non-government organizations, non-profits, and increasingly there are a wide variety of corporate social responsibility programs, councils, associations, etc., who are attempting to raise money, distribute money, and to provide goods and services that help, in addition to what the public and private sector are doing, helps to raise the quality of community life, to maximize the quality of community life for the most citizens. So we see all sorts of non-profit initiatives in trying to enhance education, in trying to enhance energy efficiency, in trying to enhance our transportation system, the quality of our natural environment, all sorts of non-profit organizations oriented toward improving race relations, to improving law enforcement, so on and so forth. Now, what about this community-based community relations and development system? Well, in the early 70s, there was legislation that was enacted that created the South Carolina Human Affairs Commission. Most of that is oriented toward the investigation of complaints of discrimination, right? But then a part of that legislation encourages the formation of community relations and development councils at the county level or at a more local level, like a city level. And those councils, the expectation is that those councils would essentially enact a citizens-based community relations and development system. Now, the current state of this system in South Carolina is we have 48 or 49 counties. I never quite get that one right. And of the 48, we have 18 counties that have active councils. Some of them are more active than others. So in some counties, we have community relations and development councils that are consistently active, provide a wide range of community relations and development services, all the way through to councils, typically in smaller counties, that are less active. Generally speaking, it would be fair and reasonable to say that the citizens-based community relations and development system, this component here of the system that helps to maximize the quality of community life for the most citizens, is undeveloped and is in need of review and development. And the purpose of the partnership between the South Carolina Human Affairs Commission and the Institute for Community Development at the North Campus of the College of Charleston is to review and to help develop this component of the overall system that helps to maximize the quality of community life for the most citizens. Okay, So let's talk a little bit then about